DX goes to DCY or some version, or goes to an operational SSTO, and it all works. And it works as good as our dreams. And what happens then is we get some new issues take effect that us as space activists and the space movement have to address. One of these is property rights in outer space. And there's people starting to talk about these. It's been issues that have been addressed before. We've got United Nations Treaty and international policy and U.S. policy that's all mostly by, almost unintended in some cases, taking precedence and affecting policy, and sometimes things that were happening 20 or 30 years ago as the politics of the time determining current policy. I'm going to say a few words, and then Professor Glenn Reynolds, who's written on these types of issues, and also he's Executive Vice President of the National Space Society and Chairman of the NSS Policy Committee. And then Alan Wasser, who's Chairman of the Executive Committee of NSS, and has written about lunar land grants. We'll talk a little bit. And we just would like to have an open discussion. I'm Charles Miller. Last year, some of my friends and I proposed what we call a space colonization initiative. And as part of that, it was named Luna 2010. I think there's certainly can be more than one space colonization initiative. We did it in response to the space exploration initiative. And the focus was in getting people in space rather than doing some exploration. As part of that, we looked at proposed getting people rights to territory, lunar land grants. We didn't specify how it would be done. We also took what we would call a bold step, and some people call it a rash step, and some people call an outrageous step, was that the United States claimed territory in the moon. And not just claim territory, but so the public could visualize that we propose that the United States claimed the Northern Hemisphere. So you could look up and see, hey, yeah, that's, I know what the Northern Hemisphere is, half the moon. And these affect, specifically to do this, we propose that the United States withdraw from the United Nations Outer Space Treaty of 1967 that the United States signed, which prohibited this. Also some other issues that are coming up that are related are the UN Moon Treaty, which the United States didn't sign. As part of, a small part of the efforts of the L5 Society in the late 70s, which was to give land up to people, to divide profits of anything that came from extraterrestrial bodies of the moon to all nations, and for the common heritage of all mankind. What I see as the issue that we as a community have to address is providing private property rights in a secure environment that individuals and corporations are willing to put large amounts of capital at risk, that they have a degree of certainty of how any disputes will be handled, and that their rights will be protected and not subject to political gamesmanship, and that that's the worst thing you can do to a business person is change the rules on them. You tell them what the rules in, and they'll want to play. And basically, there's really three options I see set up that we can go. The first one is that you can do it under United Nations auspices, which basically no one seems really want to do. You can, well, there's more than three. You can do it on individual new nations and proclaiming their own sovereignty, and you can have current existing nations claim sovereignty on property. And one proposal that was written on by Mr. Wainwright a while ago in the L5 News was that You don't have to have any nation provide sovereignty over it, but individuals can have property rights under a legal regime that, as long as they just subject to their own nation's laws. I'm a pragmatist on this. I personally think the cleanest way would be to go to have an existing nation's laws and property rights, preferably the United States. It's the cleanest way to do it. There's been claims that this is going to cause war. I am very skeptical that the United States would ever go to war with another free democratic nation that somehow based rule of law. We have conflicts all the time with our friends and neighbors, Japan, Europe. We settle them through diplomacy, negotiations, and that's what we have a State Department for. There's never been a case of two free democratic nations based on the rule of law that have gone to war against each other. Particularly even now, their peoples, their publics would not even stand for it. You would be laughed out of office if you proposed something like this as a leader of a current democratic nation. But all that being aside, it may not be possible. With current society, this draws a lot of emotions. I work right now doing work for Indian tribes, and there's a lot of harsh emotions that this draws about the American West and all the damage that was done, and the guilt factor that many world citizens have. And although the policy-wise it might not work, the emotions are real. And it might not just be politically correct and politically doable to have, at least in my lifetime, to have an issue corrected. But I would like to hear more from Glenn now on how he sees a doable property rights system and for the immediate future, and how this might integrate into a long-term stable property rights system that as humans expand beyond and maybe even consider forming nations and lots of people are out there, and how this would work along that lines. And then maybe we can get Alan up a little bit later and talk about his ideas on lunar land grants, because that short term might be helpful.
Well, it's always nice to start with the first questions, and the first question we might start with here is, why do we care about property rights at all? Well, there are lots of reasons why you might care about property rights. If you're a hardcore natural law, Lockean sort of philosopher, you might simply believe that property rights are sacred, you have to have them, and it's a matter of principle, an almost sort of religious article of faith. Someone's making the sign of the cross. Well, probably a lot of people in our organization actually feel that way. Certainly some do. But to my mind, that's not the reason why, as space activists, we ought to care about property rights. I think, in general, as space activists, we should treat property rights the way we treat anything else, which is we should ask the simple question, what do they do for space development? Well, that's an interesting question, because it seems pretty clear that the existence of property rights and outer space resources is good for space development. Property rights in general are key to prosperity. Most economists agree that that's the case. History seems to bear it out, and indeed, most personal experience bears it out. When you own a business, you care a lot more about how it does than when you don't, when you just work for it, when you're a customer. I can speak from personal experience that when you own a home, you care a lot more about its condition than you do when you rent one. Almost as much as you do when you rent one to someone else. Property rights give people incentives. When you own property, you are an equity player. When the thing in which you own property becomes more valuable, you get richer. When it becomes less valuable, you get poorer. This gives you a better reason to make things get more valuable than just about anything else. People have tried a variety of other systems to give you similar incentives. The Russians tried shipping you off to the Gulag if you didn't work hard enough. Before that, the Tsar had people with whips. doing the same sort of thing. The results of that approach speak for themselves. Property rights produce powerful incentives to create wealth. In our own nation's history, notwithstanding the feelings that some Indian tribes may have about the development of the West, property rights, land grants to railroads, and so on, played a powerful role in producing development in the West, and for some fairly obvious reasons. If you wanted somebody to put a railroad through the West, and you gave them a bunch of land along its route, what you were giving them wasn't worth very much. It was chunks of wilderness, like lots of other chunks of wilderness. But if the railroad produced the rail line that ran through those chunks of land, they then became attractively located along rail lines and became much more valuable, giving the railroad a great stake in succeeding. Much more than you would give if you proceeded in the kind of fashion that seems to be popular today, in which you paid the railroad a lot of money to design the railroad for 5, 10, 20 years without ever actually building it, and then gave the whole thing up as a bad deal. That seems to be the popular modern system for such issues. Property rights provide powerful incentives. As space activists, that's why we have always supported private property rights in outer space resources, in the hopes that corporations and individuals would be inspired by the prospect of making money to go out and develop these resources, because we have felt all along, and we've clearly been right about this, that government programs couldn't be relied on to give us the results we wanted. That hasn't stopped us from trying to get government programs that we liked, but it certainly suggests that we shouldn't put all our eggs in that basket. Property rights encourage private activity, which is not subject to the same kind of political and budgetary debates. Now, it's for that reason that NSS's predecessor organization, L5, opposed the 1979 Moon Treaty. And some of you don't need to be told anything about this, but a little bit of backtracking on that. The 67 Outer Space Treaty, contrary to widespread belief, doesn't have a thing to say about property rights. Article 2 of the 67 Outer Space Treaty simply says there shall be no national appropriation of the moon and other celestial bodies by means of sovereignty or any other means. It doesn't say anything about private property rights whatsoever. Now, there is a school of thought that says you can't have private property rights without national sovereignty, but that's pretty clearly wrong. And in fact, I asked Carol Rose, who teaches property law at Yale and is generally considered sort of the leading property scholar in the country, said, "Can you have property rights without sovereignty?" She said, "Of course, only an idiot would think otherwise." So, you can have property rights without sovereignty. So the 67 Outer Space Treaty really leaves things open for private property rights. Not for national appropriation. You could not, as Luna 2010 suggested, annex half of the moon and make it a state while remaining a party to the 67 Outer Space Treaty. But you don't really need to have private property rights.
On the last item, while her logic is somewhat compelling, I guess, did she give an example?
Actually, she gave several, yeah, and it's going to sort of pull me off track to talk about it, but actually there's a whole bunch of studies.
Just say yes, it's sufficient.
Yes, she did, yes. There's actually a surprisingly large amount of scholarship on property rights in the absence of sovereignty and how they tend to be recognized and created among collective groups and function quite efficiently. Wayne White also, actually, in the article that Chaz Miller referred to, pointed out that if you do stuff on the moon, like lunar mining, the rights you acquire under international law just by virtue of being there, such as being immune to disturbance by other nations and no one being allowed to kick you out and interfere with the operation, look a lot like property rights already, most of them anyway. And I think that's right. Now, the Moon Treaty was a recognition of this. The people who drafted the Moon Treaty specifically said, you can have private property under the Outer Space Treaty. We think private property is bad. Therefore, we're going to draft the Moon Treaty to prevent this. And that's exactly what the Moon Treaty does, particularly in Article 11. It provides that there's not going to be any lunar development, except maybe in the early experimental stages. But once it's a going concern, there'll be no lunar development except by an internationally organized authority, sort of international monopoly organization, that will do everything and provide a rake-off of its profits to third world countries, regardless of the amount of capital they have at risk, which presumptively would be zero. Well, the space activists at the time, this looked like a bad deal. It didn't look like it was going to do much to promote lunar development or other space development. It looked like it would shut a lot of things down. For that reason, L5 lobbied quite vigorously and with surprising effectiveness to prevent the United States from ratifying the Moon Treaty. And in fact, the United States did not ratify the Moon Treaty. It nonetheless entered into force in July of 1984. Now, it entered into force, making it binding among the countries who had signed and ratified it. Those include such space powers as Chile and Uruguay. It is, however, in force. It creates some opportunities for us. We don't like the Moon Treaty. We're happy it's generally regarded as a flop, and it is generally regarded as a flop by just about everybody. Nobody who really matters has signed on to it. It binds only people who nobody cares about in the space context. It didn't accomplish what its drafters set out to accomplish. But by its own terms, in Article 18, it comes up for review 10 years later in the UN General Assembly. That means summer of '94. That's a little over a year from now. And that review allows non-signatories, such as the United States, to voice their opinion on how it might be amended. Now, NSS has already been working on this issue. We've been in communication with the State Department, the White House, Al Gore's office, and a variety of other government agencies on this issue. We're sort of ahead of the curve. Most of them, when we first contacted them this spring, were kind of like, Moon Treaty? Yeah, I've heard of that. But we piggybacked on this process. There's a similar treaty having to do with ocean rights and deep seabed mining, so the Law of the Sea Treaty, their companion treaties. And the U.S. government has already started a review process on that to decide whether we should try and get some amendments and ratify it. After all, we also refused to ratify that one. And we sort of piggybacked on that effort. And we are in pretty good shape on this issue because the Clinton-Gore people care a lot about competitiveness and sort of economic nationalism, and seem to be generally receptive to the notion that we ought to get a better deal out of these treaties. But they also like the idea, as do a lot of other people, of amending the treaty so as to save it. We've had the advantage of a lot of political change since the 70s. Sort of third world statist monopoly economics is in rather bad repute since it's failed everywhere. And sort of free market approaches and property rights and so on are in a lot better repute since they've worked pretty much everywhere they've been tried. And that means that even a lot of third world countries are a lot more receptive to a more open regime. And we've been working on that and trying to formulate exactly what we want. It's always nice to know what you would ask for if somebody said exactly what you want. One of my law professors used to say, if you were czar of the universe, which I presume makes you pretty exalted, and what would you ask for here? And that's what we've been working on in terms of our position. There's been a number of proposals. My favorite is Jim Bennett's reverse Polish Moon Treaty, an approach based on the Polish privatization scheme. There are a number of other approaches the United States might try. One thing that we've talked about for a unilateral action is something analogous to the Deep Seabed Hard Mineral Resources Act. When the U.S. refused to ratify the Law of the Sea Treaty, we passed a statute that said, here's a regime in which U.S. citizens can go mine the seabeds, and we explicitly say we're not exerting our sovereignty over this, but we'll protect them if anybody tries to stop them, and we've got a licensing set up and so on. We would like to get something like that passed for space if we can't get something better out of the Moon Treaty. What we'd like to get out of the Moon Treaty, though, is an explicit recognition of private property rights. Something that says it's okay for individuals and corporations to go and exploit the resources of the moon and other celestial bodies. There might be some sort of land grant mechanism. National appropriation is forbidden by the Outer Space Treaty. So is appropriation by non-governmental or intergovernmental organizations, but most people believe that that doesn't include the UN. And we might look for some kind of new mechanism in which the UN would make land grants. One beauty of this approach is it turns all the UN space bureaucracy into instant allies of ours, since they're always happy to have anything to do that makes them important. They don't have a lot of that, so they're pretty happy on that. Another proposal that actually circulated within the US government last year, and I was involved in this, was killed off by people from NASA, strangely enough, after everybody else bought onto it. It's the notion of simply creating a claims registry now, in which U.S. citizens or others who discover resources on the moon can file. And this claims registry wouldn't guarantee that you had the right to these minerals, but would establish your priority for the purpose of some future regime that would set up mining rights and so on. And this actually was approved by people everywhere in Commerce, even in the State Department, in the Space Council, but he was killed by people from NASA who thought it was wacky. Actually,
That was their argument.
yeah, it was Diana Hoyt, actually, and Mike Griffin's shop, who thought this was too weird, and that, could imperil the future of their office.
Is that like you did a man?
Hmm?
You did a man?
Yeah, it's all my fault, sorry.
Now you can get it passed.
Yeah. Well, no, actually, it was obviously their lack of vision in going for this that undercut their position, I'm sure, and we should spread that rumor. One proposal, in addition, has been that NSS should take matters into its own hand and establish its own registry for such rights. That's something Alan and I have talked about. This would be more in the realm of a publicity stunt than anything else, although in fact there are a number of private registries involving important legal rights that exist already, so there would be some precedent for it.
Is NSS an NGO to you?
Yes.
I just wanted to make a quick comment on the land registry. It was done in the United States, in the frontier. For those areas where you have territories, they formed land grant corporations that handle all the registry.
Absolutely.
Totally private, no government involved.
That's one of those precedents of non-governmental property rights schemes that I was talking about. In fact, it's quite common in mining communities and other areas, and that's absolutely right. There is a precedent for that. In short, what we're going to be doing over the next year and a half is to try to influence the position of the United States, and perhaps that of some other foreign countries with which we have good relations, to, by we I mean NSS, not just the United States, to support a moon treaty that will be very thoroughly revised with the common heritage of mankind provisions that imperil property rights stripped out, and something that will promote space development inserted as well. I will say that this may all seem very remote to people at this point, particularly in this somewhat depressing period for space activism. The only thing I will say is, I don't want to give away too much of my breakfast speech tomorrow, where I'll talk about what it means to be a space activist. But one of the things it means to be a space activist, it seems to me, is to be in it for the long haul. We're talking about the whole future of the human species here, and depressing as it may be for those of us who see our hair receding and our chances of going to space receding at, well, actually roughly similar rates. The fact is, we are in it for the long haul, and the long run is here a lot faster than most of us expect. And these kinds of incentives make an enormous difference, more than you can foresee at the time. One of my favorite examples of that is in 1875, Britain passed an extremely wise and sensible law, or so they thought, called the Explosives Act, which said that private individuals couldn't experiment with ordnance. What this meant was that while in the United States and Germany and a variety of other places, amateur groups did rocket experiments, in Britain they weren't allowed to. And various cratered parts of London bore testament to the effect of this bad piece of legislation. If somebody had gone around in 1920 to repeal the Ordnance Act on the grounds that it inhibited amateur rocketry, a lot of people would have thought it was silly and had no particular relevance. But 20 years later came a lot faster than people probably expected. And we may find the same sort of thing now. Certainly, I think it's worth our time and attention. Thanks a lot. Alan, do you want to talk about some of this?
Well, you really covered it thoroughly. Actually,
I always try to earn my speaking fees here.
I wasn't expecting to talk, but the only point...
Worth twice that.
The only point that I would want to add, the reason I got involved in this, is the logic that comes from you start from the premise we all want to see a return to the moon and colonization, settlement of the moon. That inevitably leads to the, well, where is the money going to come from question. And the answers are always either the taxpayers, which obviously isn't working too well, or some product that you can bring back that's going to make it worth the cost of going and settling. And everything I've seen indicates that there is no such product, at least at this point, because the cost of going and getting it is so large, and the cost of bringing it back is so large, that you can't possibly make it make sense to do that way. And then it occurred to me there was one product you could bring back that made sense, which is the original product that everybody, the explorers, had always brought back: ownership. Land ownership was always the reason for settling, for exploring and settling. And frankly, to me, I look at the budgets of the United States and the Soviet Union in space exploration up to the point of the 67 treaty. And then after the 67 treaty. And I think there's a correlation because it goes like that, and then it goes like that. And the reason was, I think, that the decision until the 67 treaty, you can find New York Times articles talking about fear that the Russians were going to claim the moon. It was a serious issue. They were afraid we were going to claim it. There was a serious question as to whether they would claim it on the basis of an unmanned rocket that hit the moon. Front page of the New York Times. Will the Russians claim the moon based on this rocket that was on its way unmanned, that crashed into the moon?
With the Soviet flag that popped out of it.
Right. They didn't, but there was a real question that when they landed a man there, they would. And Johnson, to me, made a deal in which both sides agreed that the race would not involve the prize. That we would agree that nobody would take the prize, and therefore suddenly the Russian interest in going to the moon went down a lot. We kept going, but our budgets went down a lot, and we didn't claim the moon, and all we brought back was a few rocks, and everybody said, why did we bother doing all this? Until that time, it was a serious question. It was a serious reason for Kennedy's efforts to go to Apollo. There were military analyses talking about what the military value of owning the moon would be that went into going into the justification. The 67 treaty came along, everybody said, nobody's going to own the moon, it's all a scientific act, it's great, it's wonderful, and that was the end of that. If you set up a regime in which, whether it's administered by the UN or under any structure that says, if you settle on the moon and keep a man there, you own 500 square miles, 1,000 square miles around your base, and you own them immediately, and you have valid title to them, which you can start selling that day. Now you have a product that you have brought back from the moon just by going there. You send one guy or 3 guys, and they sit there, and you don't take them back until their relief comes. You have a permanent settlement on the moon, you own the land around it, you have a valid title that will be recognized by a US or Japanese court. You can sell pieces of it that day and start recouping your investment. If they found some incredible jewel that you could mine on the moon, you not only have to go there, you have to set up a mining operation, and you have to transport it back before you can sell it. Here, Mitsubishi and Boeing form a consortium. They put a man on the moon, they own this land, they immediately start selling off pieces of the land. Now, what's the land right worth? Free market. What was a piece of Alaska worth the day after Seward bought it? People who bought it then sold it to greater fools later, who sold it to greater fools later. Each one made a profit. In truth, none of them could get there in the early days, but eventually it became really valuable. And in truth, especially if you ended up having the piece that had the oil.
Yeah, but it's a lot easier to exploit land on Earth, even in Alaska, than it is to exploit the land on the moon.
It wasn't then. When that land was originally, when that first came on the market, it was every bit as tough to exploit for them as it is now for the moon. Now keep in mind, we're talking about you only gain this land by opening a permanent settlement. To open a permanent settlement, you obviously have to be able to go back and forth. All right? Therefore, there is a rocket now going back and forth by the consortium of Mitsubishi, Boeing, and Lockheed, if you want. They're going to be going back and forth. They have to go back and forth to keep their rights. While they're going back and forth, now they can carry cargo. Now the guy who buys a piece of their land has a way to get to it. He can set up a helium-3 mine or an astronomical observatory or a tourist hotel or whatever you want. He knows there's going to be a ship going back and forth every few months. And so suddenly, that incidentally was not the case if you bought a chunk of downtown Nome right after Seward had it. There was no way to get to it. Of course, eventually it was. And so, as far as I'm concerned, this is the only possible way that we can cost justify settlement of the moon in the near term and possibly forever. Now,
Your
once
tourist hotel will work.
I'm sorry?
Your tourist hotel will work.
Fine.
And that's,
Once, I mean,
people
you
will
know,
definitely pay for.
none of
tourists
these
that don't
things
come
will
along.
pay for it themselves up front. None of the products involved are going to be sufficient to justify the cost of going to the moon on their own. But as add-ons to the Mitsubishi monthly rocket, now suddenly it changes. And now suddenly the economy works. And I keep saying, I used it as an example in an article, would anybody have settled North America yet if you couldn't claim the land you built the Virginia colony on? If it was, if you could bring back the rocks and sell them in England, but you didn't own Pennsylvania or Virginia, they would never have settled. And so that's why I feel that the question of property is not merely an interesting academic question. It is the fundamental question of will we settle?
In the words of that great legal and economic thinker, Lex Luthor, one of the Superman movies, what was it he said? Governments fail, banks fail, stocks crash, people are no damn good. There's one thing they need, and they'll pay through the nose to get it, and that's land.
Yeah.
Actually, North America was settled a couple hundred years before that by people who could not claim the land. It was the British fishermen who came to Newfoundland who were not allowed to land instead of permanent settlements, who did so anyway, and were hunted down by the folks who came, by the admirals of the fishing fleets. But you had people deserting the ships and living there anyway.
Well, actually, you could go even further back and say North America was settled by the descendants of the Mongolians who came across the Bering Strait and who very much did claim the land.
That's right, yes.
So we ethnically cleansed them.
Yeah.
They didn't have
Yeah.
I'm wondering, slightly on a different issue, is there any concern in terms of law of preventing Coca-Cola from going up and putting a big sign on the moon that you can see from Earth saying Coke is it or something?
See it from here? You're talking about a very large piece of land. From the moon
Or
to
in
here.
orbit, say, even just in orbit.
That's, in orbit is conceivable, and that's not really governed by any of this question. On the moon, to do it, you would have to, considering the size of the moon, in order to read Coca-Cola, you have to own the whole moon. And the one thing I wouldn't want is a property situation where the first guy got to claim so much of the moon, there was no incentive for the second guy to get there. The whole point is to set off a race. Presumably, first guy would have to get a bigger piece than second guy. But the amount involved has to be carefully tailored so that when Mitsubishi and Boeing form a consortium, Aerospatiale and somebody else have a reason to form a second consortium to race them, knowing that even if these guys get there first, they get a nice big chunk on the other side, or further down, or somewhere else, if they get there second. And now, hopefully, you end up with a real land rush. And where the ultimate value will come back, it becomes academic, because people have been buying land, quote, in the path of progress, that was utterly valueless today, and making vast fortunes doing that. Somebody bought up a whole lot of worthless swampland south of Orlando and held it for years, during which he did nothing but pay taxes to Florida. Maybe he sold it to somebody else for a small profit, who also held it for a small profit, until ultimately Disney bought it to build the Disney World. The history of mankind is replete with those things. It's not really stupid to buy worthless land and hold it for the day when it isn't worthless. And the moon is a whole lot of worthless land.
Risk capital only, as they say.
More for Glenn, where exactly does the UN, some of these UN agencies stand in terms of defining a property rights mechanism, a claim, sale, transfer, deed mechanism? Is anybody actually working up position papers for this thing next year?
Not yet. We're ahead of the curve on this issue, and we're hoping to stay that way. What's likely to happen, actually, as I understand it, it's going to come up next summer, in '94. It'll be referred to something called the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which is a committee that deals with space issues. And they'll probably spend a year or more sort of studying it and produce a report and go back to the General Assembly. Our goal is to influence the position of the United States and as many other countries as we can going into that process, and then also try to lobby them while we're involved, while the process is underway. But right now, you know, well, I got a very nice letter back from Al Gore's office in response to something we sent them on this, which sort of said, gee, yeah, we'd sort of forgotten about this issue. You know, we knew it was out there, but we hadn't really started thinking about it yet, so thanks for jump-starting us on it. And that's kind of the position that just about everybody's in right now. I mean, hardly anybody but us has kept thinking about this issue since it last went away.
Would the National Space Society then actually write draft UN resolutions, draft legislation like happens in U.S. Congress, where you know, somebody outside of the actual thing gives it to somebody on staff, all of a sudden it's an official document, but it's got the right
That is our fond hope.
Okay.
I'd like to say something, you know, in context with what Glenn was saying earlier. A lot of people, you know, not necessarily everybody in this room, has been experiencing a depression from recent events and changes in the space program. SEI closing, a lot invested in that, redesigning space station again, 12 years invested in the space movement of that. A lot of people put a lot in there, and wondering now if all their work and energy and commitment has been of any real value. The fact that we're even talking about property rights in outer space, it shows that some people have their eyes on the larger picture. And the fact that SSTO is coming up, and in response to an earlier question, I only think property rights is even a valid question unless we bring down launch costs in order of 1 or 2 orders of magnitude. And the fact that we're willing to talk about this means we have a positive outlook that we're going to solve this problem. Okay, and then we're already looking forward to having the mechanism set up for the next thing. And I think we have to do this. I think we, as leaders in the space movement, have to be taking a forward-looking view of the space movement, and the fact that a few short-term programs are having difficulties is a minor bump in the road.
Has the NSS board adopted as a policy the idea that any property rights mechanism will be supranational through the United Nations, or so the issue of national sovereignty beyond the atmosphere has not been put to bed yet?
No, and in fact, if we were to lose on this issue and not get what we wanted from the UN, our next position would be to urge the U.S. to go unilaterally along something analogous to the Deep Seabed Hard Mineral Resources Act. So I don't think we would want to take that position. Randy?
Comment, I don't know if you can respond to this question or not, but certainly it's a much more benign political environment for doing this than it was in the 70s. But there's still a lot of people, particularly in the UN, who have an emotional attachment to collectivism despite the evidence. And they will at least preach it, if not actually practice it, because they know it does destroy their economies. And for that reason, there's still probably going to be maybe some battle preparation to do.
Oh, absolutely. I don't expect it to be a walkover at all. What I think it is possible, which I think in the 70s it was not. I mean, the chance of getting anything we liked in the 70s was nil. And now I think it is realistically possible. And indeed, in this sense, the general pessimism about where stuff is going in space makes a big difference to us. In the 70s, you know, still flush with the moon landings and, you know, with at least the appearance of something still going on with Apollo, Soyuz, and Skylab, a lot of people really sort of thought, boy, this is going to make a difference for us, you know, soon, in 10, 15, 20 years. Now, I think the pendulum swung from over-optimism to over-pessimism, so that a lot of people aren't going to fight very hard on this issue because, frankly, their position is going to be, this is a worthless bargaining chip they can trade away that, you know, is not worth anything to them to fight for anyway. And we can actually use that to our advantage, I think.
Let me butt in here on this. It's like, I wanted to say before, the one thing that bothered me most about 2010 was the implication that the U.S. would claim the land just for doing so. The whole point of claiming the land, to me, is as an incentive for settlement. And the last thing I want is any mechanism that allows anybody to claim a damn thing without settlement. And I think, frankly, if a land rush got going, the current cost of launch would not stop people. Apollo was doable a long time ago. Technology has actually improved. If the incentive were sufficient, we could absolutely restart the land rush. Then the cost of launch would come down.
If there was a race, there might be a lot of investment in launch technology.
Sure, if there was a race.
I don't think
if there
we'd
was a
get there and be able to make that claim and sustain people on the moon.
Well, it's not just the launch technology. I think it brings down launch costs, it's volume of traffic.
Right, it's very impressive. Actually, a little calculations once on this, in which I sort of just asked myself, I said, what if we hadn't been idiots? Now, I can grant you that's a big assumption in the space field. But I said, what if we had kept the Saturn V production lines open, and we had then continued to crank out Saturn Vs, and we had spent exactly as much money on space as we have anyway, through shuttle and station and all this kind of stuff. And I found it very hard in that, with those assumptions, to come up with a scenario in which we didn't have colonies on the moon by now. So while I think lowering launch costs is quite important, and you can certainly do that with a lot of interesting new technologies because we're quite inefficient at launching space travel, volume will lower your launch costs a lot. I mean, we shut down the Saturn V production line pretty much exactly at the point which we'd amortized all the costs and could produce them at marginal cost. And marginal cost was a lot less. And presumably, if you kept launching a bunch of them, you'd get your operations down and you could shrink your army of ground workers, present experience to the contrary, because you recall, my assumption is we're not idiots. And you could actually lower even your marginal cost over time and produce a real reduction in launch costs simply through volume. And of course, it's possible that we could do even better than that, although I did hear somebody remark at one of these things. He said, we could do this with Apollo-era technology. And then he stopped and he said, in fact, if we really had to, we could even do it with present technology.
But always assuming that there's an economic justification for doing it.
Exactly.
Which there is not now, and I'm convinced cannot be without property rights. And in answer to your question about NSS on national sovereignty, on the contrary, I would love to see national sovereignty be an issue, because then you could have races between nations again. Our most product was done when there was, in fact, no prohibition against national sovereignty. And the US and Russia were busy worrying about the other guy getting sovereignty. And that's when there was a space race. And it stopped when that issue went away. Private property to me is fine in that we could indeed get big corporations involved. But national sovereignty would actually get nations involved. And is it messy? Is it elegant? I mean, obviously it's not as ethereally elegant as a common heritage, but it works. And I think that's why it's not working now. You disagree?
Adamantly. I think that if you've got to, if you have to have, I think this is more of a moral argument than anything else. And the practice to date has been that basically national sovereignty stops when an air-breathing engine stops. And in order to avoid militarization of space, which is the corollary to national sovereignty, you've got to just draw an absolute policy line.
Let me ask you an overly simplistic question. If, in fact, the choice really were clearly and unequivocally, and you agree that the choice were no colonization, no settlement of the moon, and a morally pure no national sovereignty, or national sovereignty with all of its attendant ills and settlement of the moon, which would you choose? Because I honestly believe that really is the question.
That's an easy question for me, because I'm a fanatic.
It's an easy question for me too, and it isn't for
I'm
everyone.
willing to accept small nuclear wars, not big ones.
Proposition. I think if it's handled correctly, you can find a supranational entity to do it and still do it right.
Fine.
So
Perfectly, that's what we're looking towards, is the idea. I mean, the UN set up a regime which says you own this much land if you do this, but if you
We
do
got a couple
settlement.
more minutes here. We got to ask a question real quickly and get out, because they're going to open this up and this part of the banquet. Ben.
Just a point of information. This has gotten some visibility outside the space community. The latest issue of Futurist magazine has an article by someone at the UN discussing what he calls the global commons, the oceans, the atmosphere, and outer space. And he does propose a UN organization to handle this, but he does use the terminology, the common heritage of man. So, so other people are thinking
The
about...
tragedy of the commons.
Well, yes, actually, he talks about the tragedy of the commons, but he does mention the 67 Outer Space Treaty and the Moon Treaty. So other people are thinking about this, at least at the UN.
This gentleman over here.
I was wondering if anyone has, I imagine this might sound really off the wall, but if anyone has done much study of, if you have, say I go and land on the moon and my country is now protecting me, people get together, do people think it likely that eventually there will be other nations formed on the moon because people say, for whatever stupid reason, no, we don't like them doing this and that, the other thing to us? Is there any laws?
Certainly, it fits the history of
It's
mankind.
inevitable.
I mean,
There's actually
are the laws that would
writing on the subject, and in
affect
fact,
that?
Article 73 of the UN Charter actually would apply under those circumstances because it deals. Article 73 says that countries exercising jurisdiction over territories that are not yet capable of self-governance have certain responsibilities to basically respect basic human rights and help them foster self-governance. And although it was intended to apply to old trust territories and mandates from the League of Nations, there's nothing in this language that keeps it from applying to space societies. And there is actually some scholarship in the international law field to the effect that it would apply to space societies.
How do you guys have some of the answers?
I'm sorry, Dale's been waiting for
Actually, you're getting right onto the points that I was going to bring up, which is that under my understanding of the UN Charter, there is a self-determination in there, and that nobody has ever satisfactorily answered to me how the 67 Treaty can be put together with the wordings in the UN Charter on basic rights of people to self-determination. If you get a colony out there, there is going to come a point in one day where they are going to say, we want our independence. At that point, you have a national organization, national expropriation of a part of the body in space. There's no way
There are two
around
answers
it.
to that.
Yeah.
One is that nobody thought about that when they drafted the Outer Space Treaty. But a better answer is that anyway, if you got a new nation on the moon declaring sovereignty, it would not be a party to the Outer Space Treaty, and thus would not be bound by that. And indeed, the Outer Space Treaty explicitly says that general principles of international law, including the UN Charter, apply to activity in outer space, meaning that self-determination principle is explicitly extended to the moon. Therefore, it would apply to those circumstances, I think.
Steve, last question.
I was going to say, actually, it's more like a comment. People are saying, well, should we have national sovereignty or not? And to me, the UN is just another level above, and why can't you just treat a nation like any other entity? Just say, block out parts of the moon and say, any entity can own it. Nation, corporation, individual, group, doesn't matter. Because when people can do things like going to different planets and doing, taking up chunks of property, geography doesn't matter anymore. It's more like management structure. So nations will become, in essence, corporations.
Is the answer to the point you made before as well, which is, it is, however, moot because in the absence of a private property regime, nobody's going. There is no settlement on the moon to declare its independence or to become a nation.
But I understand
So
that's what
indeed,
it's set up.
the problem solves itself in that sense. As long as there's no private property, there'll be nobody to claim it. And there'll
I
be
guess
nobody to
one of my
independence.
concerns is when the U.S. corporation says we have this land and we have a U.S. claims registry, and the Japanese corporation says we claim this land and it's the same land, and we have a Japanese claims registry, and they both have different rules, and that you have some equitable procedure that that things are taken care of, and there might be some systems here that allay those concerns, but they have to be communicated to that they will allay the concerns and people are certain about it. Before you're going to get the average people, citizens, politicians, business leaders to agree with it.
I think that's the advantage of having a revised moon treaty that does what we want versus a unilateral approach by the United States. The unilateral approach by the United States, I think, is very much a second best solution. It's better than nothing, but it's not as good because it's harder to feel confident about your title in the context of a unilateral
Look
system.
at Antarctica. You've got overlaying claims of territory all over the place that are back from the colonial exploration settlement area. The only reason that people haven't started shooting about it is because the economic incentives haven't been there. So I mean that's kind of the basic premise. Is if you get away from the mapping out and declaring territorial sovereignty, then you can avoid a whole host of problems.
Antarctica hasn't gone anywhere either.
That's exactly, and it has succeeded.
Take it offline.
We need to-
We're gonna have to break out.
To break out here.
It has succeeded perfectly in preventing settlement of Antarctica, as it has in the moon.
Thank you very much. Very cool.
Well, yeah, there's other factors.
Sorry to bring you up.
You make a very